A husband publicly humiliates his broke wife and proposes to another woman, never realizing that the quiet wife secretly controls the fortune behind his entire empire, and she is about to expose everything. First, subscribe. The ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of crystal lights. 300 guests had gathered that evening, dressed in their finest clothes, expecting to celebrate 10 years of marriage between Galani and Yumna. The flowers were perfect. The music was soft. The tables were covered with white roses and expensive crystal glasses. And Yumna had planned every detail. She had chosen the ballroom. She had paid for the flowers. She had arranged the dinner, the band, and even the beautiful stage where her husband was supposed to renew his vows to her. She stood near the front of the room wearing a simple dark dress and her wedding ring. For one brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps Galani had changed. Perhaps tonight, after 10 difficult years, he would finally remember the woman who had stood beside him when he had almost nothing. The woman who had cared for his sick father. The woman who had stayed awake through countless nights while Galani chased business deals. The woman who had given him a daughter. But then Galani stepped onto the stage. He smiled at the crowd. Not at Yumna. At everyone except her. 10 years is a long time, he began. The guests listened quietly. Galani turned slowly toward Yumna. His expression became cold. 10 years is long enough to learn who belongs in your life, he said. Yumna's heart tightened. Then he looked past her. Straight toward Immani. The younger woman was sitting near the stage, dressed in silver, waiting with a smile. Galani walked toward her. A confused murmur spread through the ballroom. Yumna did not move. Galani stopped in front of Immani and reached into his pocket. Then he opened a velvet ring box. The room fell completely silent. He dropped to one knee. I finally know who the right woman is, he said. Then he looked toward Yumna. Wrong woman. Gasps filled the room. Immani covered her mouth, pretending to be surprised. Galani smiled and held out the ring. Immani, will you marry me? For a moment, nobody knew how to react. Then his mother began clapping. His father raised his champagne glass. Soon, several guests joined in. Yumna stood completely still. What kind of husband humiliates his wife in front of 300 people? She looked at Galani. 10 years of memories passed through her mind. The little church where they had married. The first home they shared. The nights she spent beside his father's hospital bed. The countless sacrifices nobody had ever thanked her for. And now this. She slowly reached for her wedding ring. Her fingers trembled only once. Then she pulled it from her finger. I gave you 10 years of my life, but I will not give you one more second of my dignity. Yumna placed the ring gently on the white tablecloth. Keep it, she said quietly. Galani stared at her. She gave him one calm look. You will need something to remember this by. Then she turned and began walking away. No screaming. No tears. No begging. Only silence. And as she walked toward the ballroom doors, nobody noticed the small purse in her hand. Inside it was an old watch left to her by her father. Nobody knew what was hidden behind that watch. Nobody knew that the woman they had spent 10 years calling poor was connected to a fortune powerful enough to change Galani's entire future. They thought Yumna was walking away with nothing. They had no idea she was walking away with everything. Never mistake a quiet woman for a powerless woman. Yumna had walked out of that ballroom without shedding a single tear. But behind her calm face was a decade of memories that nobody in that room understood. 10 years earlier, Galani had not been the powerful businessman everyone admired. His company was small. His name carried little weight. And Yumna had loved him anyway. She never told his family about her own background. She never talked about money. She allowed them to believe she had come from nothing. Because her father had taught her something simple. Let people show you who they are before you show them what you have. When Galani's father became seriously ill, Yumna became the person who stayed beside him. She learned his medicines. She learned his feeding schedule. She slept in a hard chair beside his hospital bed. For 2 long years, while Galani chased business opportunities, Yumna cared for the man who had once been her father-in-law. But when he died, nobody thanked her. At the funeral, Galani's mother simply handed Yumna a pile of coats and told her to stand at the back. A distant relative even pressed $20 into her hand. For your trouble, the woman whispered. Yumna accepted it silently. They thought she was poor. They thought she was dependent on Galani. They thought she had nothing. They were wrong. But Yumna had never felt the need to prove them wrong. Until Galani started preparing his biggest business deal yet. A massive merger was about to transform his company. He came home one evening smiling proudly. "This is everything I have worked for," he told Yumna. He talked about investors, contracts, and millions of dollars. Then he looked at her coldly. "Do not embarrass me while this closes." Yumna said nothing. She simply listened. Something about the numbers bothered her. A few weeks later, while paying the household bills, she noticed a strange transaction. $40,000 had moved from their joint account. Then it returned. Then it disappeared again. Yumna stared at the statement. Why was their household account being used for business money? She wrote down the date, the amount, the account number, and she kept looking. That was when she found another document. It carried the letterhead of Meridian, the company financing Galani's merger. One section had been blacked out. Yumna photographed the page before Galani could discover it. That night, she contacted Winston Bello, her late father's trusted lawyer. The next morning, she placed the documents on his desk. Winston studied them quietly. Then his expression changed. "Yumna," he said, "your husband is moving business money through your shared account." She swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means he may be trying to make his financial position look stronger than it really is." Yumna stared at him. Then Winston pointed toward the blacked-out document. "There is something else." He opened an old folder. Inside was information connected to Yumna's late father. Her heart began beating faster. "What does my father have to do with Galani's merger?" Winston looked directly into her eyes. "More than Galani knows." He explained that her father had left behind a trust. Not simply cash. Not simply property. A network of quiet investments and ownership interests spread across several companies. And one of those interests was connected to the very investor Galani needed to complete his merger. Yumna could hardly breathe. Then came the worst discovery. A bank statement arrived in her name. An account she had never opened. Attached to it was a personal guarantee for the merger's debt. And beneath it was a signature. Her signature. But Yumna had never signed it. She looked at Winston in disbelief. "He forged my name?" Winston nodded slowly. "He thought you were powerless enough to carry his risk." Yumna looked down at the document. For 10 years, they had called her the broke wife. Now she finally understood. Galani had not simply stopped loving her. He had built his entire plan around believing she was worthless. And he had chosen the wrong woman to betray.